Elara had come to the town of Dust Devil Creek to die. Not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. She had signed the mail-order bride contract not for love or a new life, but for a quiet place to let her grief finish its work, to hollow her out completely until nothing remained of the woman who had once buried her own small child. But the man she was meant to marry, a farmer named Jedediah, had died of a fever a week before her stagecoach arrived, leaving her with nothing but a dusty train ticket and the hollow echo of a promise. The town council, led by the imperious Judge Thorne, had declared her a vagrant, a burden. She was to be sent back on the next coach east. Her life was a closed book, its final pages filled with failure and sorrow. She was standing at the back of the town square, a ghost among the living, waiting for her exile, when the auction began. It wasn't for cattle or land, but for people. 3 small girls, sisters, stood on the wooden platform where criminals were usually sentenced. They were the Miller orphans, Lily, the oldest at 10, her arms wrapped protectively around her 2 younger siblings, Daisy, a wisp of a thing at 7, clutching a worn ragdoll, and Rose, barely 5, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Their parents had perished in a sudden fire that had consumed their small, worthless farm on the edge of the valley. The crowd was silent, a heavy, shameful quiet that clung to the air like dust. Judge Thorne, a man whose presence was as large and dark as a thunderhead, stood beside the auctioneer. His face, a mask of predatory benevolence, surveyed the crowd. His voice boomed, dripping with false piety. These poor children need a home, a place to earn their keep. A strong back for farm work, he said, gesturing to Lily. A nimble hand for mending, he added, pointing to Daisy. And, well, the little one eats, I suppose. A cruel chuckle rippled through the men at the front. Thorne's plan was clear and monstrous, to separate them, to break the final bond they had in this world. He wanted their land, a useless patch of cracked earth that bordered his own vast ranch. By declaring them wards of the town and auctioning their labor, he could seize the deed for unpaid taxes. No one dared bid. Fear of Judge Thorne was the law in Dust Devil Creek. He owned the bank, the sheriff, and the soul of nearly every man present. The auctioneer called for a bid, his voice cracking. Silence. He called again. The girls huddled closer, a tiny island of terror in a sea of indifference. And in that moment, something shifted in Elara. The grief that had been a shroud became a fire. She saw not 3 orphans, but the reflection of her own desolation, the embodiment of a world that would discard the helpless. She saw her own lost child in their frightened eyes. Before she knew what she was doing, her voice, thin but clear, cut through the silence. $1. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads turned to stare at the stranger, the mail-order bride with nothing to her name. Judge Thorne's eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. And who are you to bid, woman? He snarled. You have no property, no husband, no standing here. Elara stepped forward, her spine straightening into a rod of steel she didn't know she possessed. My name is Elara. And I am bidding for all 3. Together Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. And what will you pay with? Grief? You are a pauper. The contract my intended husband signed promised me room and board for 1 year, even in the event of his death. The law is the law, Judge. I am owed that. I will use it to provide for them. She hadn't known if that was true, but she said it with such conviction that a murmur of uncertainty went through the crowd. Thorne's face contorted with fury. He had been publicly challenged. To back down was to show weakness, but to accept was to grant her a sliver of legitimacy. Fine, he hissed, the word a poisoned dart. Sold, to the penniless fool. Take them. Let them starve together on that cursed rock pile their parents left behind. It will be a fitting end. The auctioneer slammed his gavel, and the ordeal was over. Elara walked toward the platform, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lily, Daisy, and Rose stared at her, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. As she reached out her hand, not as a master, but as an equal, she knew her life was no longer about ending. It was, impossibly, just beginning. Ilara led her 3 small charges away from the stunned silence of the town square, their hands clutching hers as if she were the only stable thing in a world that had crumbled beneath their feet. The Miller farm was even more desolate than Thorne's cruel words had painted it. It was a scar on the land, a collection of weathered planks and broken fences huddled against the wind. The farmhouse itself was a skeleton, its bones charred black from the fire that had claimed their parents. The only structure left standing was a small, dilapidated barn, which would now have to serve as their home. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old hay and decay. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the decaying roof. This was it. This was the fortress she had claimed for them. If you were in Ilara's position, facing such impossible odds, what would be the first thing you would do? Tell me in the comments. That first night, they huddled together under a single threadbare blanket, the vast, lonely silence of the prairie pressing in on them. For the first time, Ilara felt the crushing weight of her decision. What had she done? She was a woman who could barely feed herself, now responsible for 3 grieving children. The next morning, the reality of their situation arrived in the form of a man named Silas. He was Judge Thorne's foreman, a broad-shouldered man with hands like worn leather and eyes that held a deep, conflicted sadness. He rode up to the barn, his shadow falling long and ominous across the doorway. "The judge sent me," he said, his voice flat, avoiding Ilara's gaze. "He wants you to know that the deed to this land reverts to the town in 90 days if the property taxes aren't paid. And since you have no income," he let the threat hang in the air. Ilara stood between him and the girls, a lioness she never knew she could be. "Tell Judge Thorne we will manage," she said, her voice steady. Silas looked past her, at the 3 small faces peering from the shadows, and for a moment, the hardness in his expression faltered. He saw his own daughter in Rose's frightened eyes. "He's not a patient man," he said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "He always gets what he wants." He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like an apology than a courtesy, and rode away. The encounter left Ilara shaken but resolute. Thorne's greed was a tangible threat, a countdown to their destruction. But it was also a clue. Why was he so desperate for this worthless plot of land? The soil was bone dry, the old well empty. It made no sense. In the days that followed, a fragile routine began to form. Ilara taught the girls what little she knew about survival. They patched the holes in the barn roof with mud and grass. They foraged for wild onions and tough, bitter greens. Lily, serious and practical, became Ilara's second in command. Daisy, quiet and watchful, revealed a surprising talent for finding edible roots. And little Rose, with her innocent laughter, began to heal the shattered pieces of Ilara's own heart. The memory of her lost child, once a source of unbearable pain, was slowly transforming. The love she could no longer give to her own had found a new home. It fueled her, gave her strength, turned her grief into a shield. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, Lily spoke up. "Pa was digging a new well," she said softly, pointing to a mound of fresh earth behind the burnt-out house. "He said he'd found it. He said it would change everything." The girl's words echoed in Ilara's mind. He said it would change everything. The half-dug well became a beacon of desperate hope. But their immediate problem was starvation. When Ilara walked into town to buy flour and beans, she was met with a wall of silent hostility. The general store owner, Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically removed, refused to sell to her. "I can't, Ilara," he whispered, casting a nervous glance out the window as if Judge Thorne himself might materialize from the dust. "The judge? He's forbidden anyone from trading with you. He said you're a troublemaker." The word spread like a contagion. The blacksmith wouldn't mend their broken hoe. The baker turned her away. They were being systematically starved out, isolated on their island of defiance while Thorne watched from his throne, waiting for them to break. Desperation gnawed at Ilara. She watched the girls growing thinner, the light in their eyes dimming with each passing day. The hope she had ignited was flickering, threatening to be extinguished by the cruel, calculated pressure of one powerful man. If you're finding this story of courage and resilience inspiring, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories like this. That night, with the moon as her only witness, Ilara took a shovel and went to the spot Lily had pointed out. The earth was hard, unforgiving. Her hands, soft and unaccustomed to such labor, quickly blistered and bled. She dug for hours, fueled by a frantic energy, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel a prayer against despair. Lily, unable to sleep, came to join her, her small hands helping to clear away the loose dirt. They dug in silence, a shared, unspoken determination passing between them. Just as the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, the shovel struck something hard. It wasn't rock. It was wood. Heart-pounding, Ilara dropped to her knees and clawed at the dirt. It was a small, metal-bound box. With trembling hands, she lifted it out. It was heavy, sealed with rust and time. Inside the barn, with Daisy and Rose watching, their breath held in suspense, Ilara pried the lid open. It didn't contain gold or jewels. It contained something far more valuable. On top lay a letter, written in a strong, clear hand. It was from the girl's father, Thomas Miller. To whoever finds this, it began, know that Judge Thorne is a thief and a liar. Ilara's blood ran cold as she read on. The letter explained everything. Years ago, Thorne and Thomas's father had been partners. They discovered the truth of this valley together. All the creeks and wells were seasonal, drying up in the harsh summers, except for one. A deep, powerful artesian spring, a river of life flowing beneath the earth, was located directly under this small, unassuming farm. The elder Miller had registered the primary water rights with the territorial government, making this land the most valuable in the entire region. Thorne, consumed by greed, had created a fraudulent deed, murdered his partner in a staged accident, and seized control of the surrounding territory, building his empire by controlling the valley's scarce water. He had allowed the Miller family to live on their ancestral land, believing them ignorant of the truth buried beneath their feet. The fire hadn't been an accident. Thorne had set it to finally get rid of the last Millers and seize the land before anyone could uncover his secret. Beneath the letter was the proof, the original, government-sealed deed, granting incontestable ownership and water rights to the Miller family line. Ilara looked at the three orphans, who were not just orphans, but heirs. They were not destitute, but royalty in a kingdom stolen from them. She now understood. Thorne wasn't just trying to acquire a piece of land, he was trying to bury a truth that would shatter his entire world. And now, she was the one holding the hammer. The knowledge sat in the small barn like a lit keg of gunpowder. Ilara was no longer just a protector, she was the custodian of a truth so powerful it could bring down a tyrant. But power and truth were useless if they died with you. Thorne was not a man who would allow such a secret to see the light of day. She knew he would be watching, that Silas's visit was only the beginning. The foreman's conflicted gaze was a small comfort, but he was still Thorne's man. For now. The next move had to be hers, but what could she do? March into the sheriff's office? The sheriff was Thorne's puppet, a man who polished his badge with the judge's money. She had to get the deed to the territorial marshal in the capital, over 100 miles away. It was an impossible journey for a woman alone with 3 children and no resources. The weight of this new burden was immense. She felt Thorne's unseen eyes on them constantly. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching horse, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The girls felt the tension, too. The brief period of peace was shattered, replaced by a quiet, gnawing fear. One afternoon, as Ilara was trying to figure out a way to fortify the barn door, she saw a rider approaching. It wasn't Silas. It was Judge Thorne himself, flanked by 2 armed men who looked as if they'd been carved from granite and malice. Panic seized her. He knew. He must have seen them digging. She quickly hid the box under a loose floorboard and pushed the girls behind her, her body a frail shield. Thorne dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry soil with an air of absolute ownership. His smile was a chilling sight, devoid of all warmth, a predator savoring its victory. "Good day, madam," he said, his voice smooth as oil on a blade. "I've come with a generous offer. I feel for your plight. I will give you $500. Enough to take these children and start a new life somewhere far from here." It was a fortune, more money than Elara had ever seen. For a fleeting second, the temptation was a physical force, a siren call promising safety and an end to this struggle. She could run. But then she looked down at Lily's hand clutching her skirt, at Daisy's wide, terrified eyes, and at Rose hiding behind her legs. She thought of their parents, murdered for this very land. Running wasn't safety, it was complicity. "The land is not for sale," Elara said, her voice trembling but firm. Thorne's smile vanished. "I am not asking." He took a step forward. "That was not an offer. It was a command. I have the paperwork right here declaring this property abandoned and condemned. You will leave or you will be removed." He nodded to his men, who dismounted, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. This was it. The final confrontation. The barn felt small, a trap about to spring. Just as one of the men reached for her, another voice cut through the tense air. "That's far enough, Judge." Everyone turned. It was Silas, Thorne's own foreman, sitting on his horse a short distance away, a rifle resting across his lap. His face was set in a grim, determined line. The conflict in his eyes was gone, replaced by resolve. "Silas! What is the meaning of this?" Thorne roared, his face turning a shade of purple. "Get back to the ranch." "I'm done taking your orders, Judge," Silas said calmly. "I'm done being the boot on the neck of good people." Before Thorne could react, a second surprise emerged. The town doctor, a quiet, bespectacled man named Dr. Adams, appeared from behind the charred remains of the farmhouse, followed by a dozen farmers, all armed with hunting rifles and shark guns. Dr. Adams held up a tarnished silver locket. "Thomas Miller gave this to me the day before the fire," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "He told me if anything happened to him, I should see that his family was protected. It seems I've been late in honoring that promise." The farmers fanned out, their expressions grim. They were men who had been squeezed by Thorne's control over the water for years, men who had been too afraid to fight alone but had found courage in numbers. The tide had turned. Thorne was surrounded, his power evaporating under the hot sun. He looked from the armed farmers to his own conflicted foreman, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury. Elara seized the moment. With all eyes on her, she reached under the floorboard, pulled out the deed, and held it high. "This land was never yours, Judge," she declared, her voice filled with righteous anger. "This document proves you are a thief and a murderer." The paper, old and yellowed, seemed to shine in the sunlight, a beacon of justice in a valley that had known none for far too long. The sight of the original deed, held aloft in Elara's trembling hand, was like a lightning strike in the tense standoff. The farmers murmured, their suspicion of Thorne hardening into cold certainty. The judge's face, already contorted with rage, became a terrifying canvas of pure desperation. His empire was built on a single, vital lie: control of the water, and that lie was now exposed. He was no longer a judge, he was just a man, a cornered animal about to lose everything. With a guttural roar, Thorne drew a pistol from his coat, his eyes wild. "That paper means nothing. This land is mine," he screamed, leveling the gun not at the armed men, but at Elara and the children. It was a final, despicable act of a coward. But before he could pull the trigger, Silas moved with shocking speed. He spurred his horse forward, and in one fluid motion, swung the butt of his rifle, striking Thorne's arm with a sickening crack. The pistol flew from the judge's grasp, landing in the dust. Thorne howled in pain and fury, clutching his broken arm. His two hired thugs, seeing their employer disarmed and outnumbered, exchanged a nervous glance. They were paid for intimidation, not for a battle they were certain to lose. Slowly, they raised their hands in surrender. Dr. Adams stepped forward, his face grim. "It's over, Thorne. Your reign of terror in this valley is done." The farmers closed in, their rifles steady, their faces a mixture of relief and long-suppressed anger. The power that Thorne had wielded through fear had vanished in an instant, leaving only a pathetic, broken man. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of decisive action. The farmers, now a makeshift militia of justice, took Thorne and his men into custody. Silas, his face etched with the gravity of his choice, found the sheriff cowering in his office and calmly informed him that there was a new law in Dust Devil Creek, the law of decency. The fraudulent land records at the town hall were seized, and Dr. Adams, who had also served as the town's part-time magistrate before Thorne's corruption had pushed him out, began the legal process of restoring what was stolen. The news spread through the valley like a cleansing fire. Families who had been forced to sell their land to Thorne for pennies on the dollar, families who had paid his exorbitant water fees for years, saw a path to restitution. The reveal of the artesian spring under the Miller farm didn't bring jealousy, it brought liberation. With the water rights belonging to the Miller heirs, and Elara acting as their guardian, the monopoly was broken. She made a public pledge, with Dr. Adams as a witness, water would be shared fairly and affordably with all their neighbors. The valley could finally flourish as it was always meant to. In the quiet that followed the storm, Elara stood with Lily, Daisy, and Rose, looking out at the land that was now truly theirs. It no longer looked like a desolate rock pile. It looked like a promise. It looked like a future. Lily slipped her hand into Elara's. "You were brave," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Elara looked down at the three girls, her three daughters in all but blood, and felt a wave of love so fierce it took her breath away. The hollow place in her heart was full. The grief had not been erased, but it had been given a new purpose. It had become the foundation for a new family, built not on a contract or convenience, but on courage and a shared fight for survival. The lonely, broken mail-order bride was gone. In her place stood a mother, a landowner, and a quiet hero who had given hope back to an entire valley. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and for the first time since she had arrived in Dust Devil Creek, Elara felt the warmth of a home. She had come here to let her life end, but instead, she and three little girls had just begun to live. The story doesn't end here. A new chapter was beginning for Elara and the entire valley. To see what happened next to Judge Thorne and how the community rebuilt itself, click on the video now showing on your screen.